Chapter 47, The Art of Borrowing Further Explained, and an Account of a Strange Phenomenon. In this manner did the artful incendiary work upon the passions of the credulous unsuspecting Hungarian, who pressed him to his breast with the most cordial expressions of friendship, calling him his guardian, his savior, his second father, and gave himself up wholly to his advice. Next morning, according to the plan they had laid overnight, they repaired to a tavern in the neighborhood of the person to whom our adventurer had been directed, and were fortunate enough to find him in the house, transacting a money affair with a young gentleman who treated him with his morning's wet. That affair being negotiated, he adjourned into another room with Rinaldo and his companion, who were not a little surprised to see this minister of Plutus in the shape of a young sprightly beau, trimmed up in all the foppery of the fashion, for they had hitherto always associated with the idea of unusual old age and rusty apparel. After divers modish congees, he begged to know to what he should attribute the honor of their message, when Ferdinand, who acted the orator, told him, that his friend Count Melville, having occasion for a sum of money, had been directed to a gentleman of his name, and, I suppose, added he, you are the son of the person with whom the affair is to be negotiated. Sir, said this petit maître, with a smile, I perceive you are surprised to see one of my profession in the appearance of a gentleman, and perhaps your wonder will not cease, when I tell you, that my education was liberal, and that I once had the honor to bear a commission in the British Army. I was indeed a first lieutenant of Marines, and will venture to say, that no officer in the service was more delicate than myself in observing all the punctilios of honor. I entertained the utmost contempt for all the trading part of the nation, and suffered myself to be run through the body in a duel, rather than roll with a brother lieutenant, who was a broker's son. But, thank heaven, I have long ago conquered all those ridiculous prejudices. I soon observed, that without money there was no respect, honor, or convenience to be acquired in life, that wealth amply supplied the want of wit, merit, and pedigree, having influence and pleasure ever at command, and that the world never failed to worship the flood of affluence, without examining the dirty channels through which it commonly flowed. At the end of the war, finding my appointments reduced to 2 shillings and 4 pence per day, and being addicted to pleasures which I could not possibly purchase from such a fund, I sold my half-pay for £200, which I lent upon bond to a young officer of the same regiment, on condition that he should insure his life, and restore 1/4 part of the sum by way of premium. I happened to be lucky in this first essay, for the borrower, having in 6 weeks expended the money, made an excursion on the highway, was apprehended, tried, convicted of felony, and cut his own throat, to prevent the shame of a public execution, so that his bond was discharged by the insurers. In short, gentlemen, when I engaged in this business, I determined to carry it on with such spirit, as would either make my fortune, or entirely ruin me in a little time, and hitherto my endeavors have been tolerably successful. Nor do I think my proceedings a whit more criminal or unjust than those of other merchants, who strive to turn their money to the best account. The commodity I deal in is cash, and it is my business to sell it to the best advantage. A London factor sends a cargo of goods to market, and if he gets 200% upon the sale, he is commended for industry and address. If I sell money for 1/4 part of that profit, certain persons will be so unjust as to cry, shame upon me, for taking such advantage of my neighbor's distress, not considering, that the trader took 4 times the same advantage of those people who bought his cargo, though his risk was not half so great as mine, and although the money I sold perhaps retrieved the borrower from the very jaws of destruction. For example, it was but yesterday I saved a worthy man from being arrested for a sum of money, for which he had bailed a friend who treacherously left him in the lurch. As he did not foresee what would happen, he had made no provision for the demand, and his sphere of life secluding him from all sorts of moneyed intercourse, he could not raise the cash by his credit in the usual way of borrowing, so that, without my assistance, he must have gone to jail, a disgrace which would have proved fatal to the peace of his family, and utterly ruined his reputation. Nay, that very young gentleman, from whom I am just now parted, will, in all probability, be indebted to me for a very genteel livelihood. He had obtained the absolute promise of being provided for by a great man, who sits at the helm of affairs in a neighboring kingdom, but, being destitute of all other resources, he could not have equipped himself for the voyage, in order to profit by his lordship's intention, unless I had enabled him to pursue his good fortune. Rinaldo was not a little pleased to hear this harangue, to which Fathom replied with many florid encomiums upon the usurer's good sense and humane disposition. Then he explained the errand of his friend, which was to borrow £300, in order to retrieve his inheritance, of which he had been defrauded in his absence. "Sir," said the lender, addressing himself to Count Melville, "I pretend to have acquired by experience some skill in physiognomy, and though there are some faces so deeply disguised as to baffle all the penetration of our art, there are others, in which the heart appears with such nakedness of integrity, as at once to recommend it to our goodwill. I own your countenance prepossesses me in your favor, and you shall be accommodated, upon those terms from which I never deviate, provided you can find proper security, that you shall not quit the British dominions, for that, with me, is a condition sine qua non." This was a very disagreeable declaration to Rinaldo, who candidly owned, that, as his concerns lay upon the continent, his purpose was to leave England without delay. The usurer professed himself sorry that it was not in his power to oblige him, and, in order to prevent any further importunity, assured them, he had laid it down as a maxim, from which he would never swerve, to avoid all dealings with people whom, if need should be, he could not sue by the laws of this realm. Thus the intervention of one unlucky and unforeseen circumstance blasted in an instant the budding hopes of Melville, who, while his visage exhibited the most sorrowful disappointment, begged to know, if there was any person of his acquaintance who might be less scrupulous in that particular. The young gentleman directed them to another member of his profession, and wishing them success, took his leave with great form and complaisance. This instance of politeness was, however, no more than a shift to disengage himself the more easily from their entreaties, for, when the case was opened to the second usurer, he blessed himself from such customers, and dismissed them with the most mortifying and boorish refusal. Notwithstanding these repulses, Rinaldo resolved to make one desperate push, and, without allowing himself the least respite, solicited, one by one, not fewer than 15 persons who dealt in this kind of traffic, and his proposals were rejected by each. At last, fatigued by the toil, and exasperated at the ill success of his expedition, and half mad with the recollection of his finances, which were now drained to half a crown, "Since we have nothing to expect," cried he, "from the favor of Christians, let us have recourse to the descendants of Judah. Though they lie under the general reproach of nations, as a people dead to virtue and benevolence, and wholly devoted to avarice, fraud, and extortion, the most savage of their tribe cannot treat me with more barbarity of indifference, than I have experienced among those who are the authors of their reproach." Although Fathom looked upon this proposal as an extravagant symptom of despair, he affected to approve of the scheme, and encouraged Rinaldo with the hope of succeeding in another quarter, even if this expedition should fail, for, by this time, our adventurer was half resolved to export him at his own charge, rather than he should be much longer restricted in his designs upon Monimia. Meanwhile, being resolved to try the experiment upon the children of Israel, they betook themselves to the house of a rich Jew, whose wealth they considered as a proof of his rapaciousness, and, being admitted into his counting-house, they found him in the midst of half a dozen clerks, when Rinaldo, in his imagination, likened him unto a minister of darkness surrounded by his familiars, and planning schemes of misery to be executed upon the hapless sons of men. In spite of these suggestions, which were not at all mitigated by the forbidding aspect of the Hebrew, he demanded a private audience, and, being ushered into another apartment, he explained his business with manifest marks of disorder and affliction. Indeed, his confusion was in some measure owing to the looks of the Jew, who, in the midst of this exordium, pulled down his eyebrows, which were surprisingly black and bushy, so as, in appearance, totally to extinguish his visage, though he was all the time observing our youth from behind those almost impenetrable thickets. Melville, having signified his request, "Young gentleman," said the Israelite, with a most discordant voice, "what in the name of goodness could induce you to come to me upon such an errand? Did you ever hear that I lent money to strangers without security?" "No," replied Rinaldo, "nor did I believe I should profit by my application, but my affairs are desperate, and my proposals having been rejected by every Christian to whom they were offered, I was resolved to try my fate among the Jews, who are reckoned another species of men. Fathom, alarmed at this abrupt reply, which he supposed could not fail to disgust the merchant, interposed in the conversation, by making an apology for the plain dealing of his friend, who, he said, was soured and ruffled by his misfortunes. Then exerting that power of eloquence which he had at command, he expostulated upon Rinaldo's claim and expectations, described the wrongs he had suffered, extolled his virtue, and drew a most pathetic picture of his distress. The Jew listened attentively for some time, then his eyebrows began to rise and fall alternately. He coughed, sneezed, and winking hard, "I'm plagued," said he, "with a salt rheum that trickles from my eyes without intermission." So saying, he wiped the moisture from his face, and proceeded in these words: "Sir, your story is plausible, and your friend is a good advocate, but before I give an answer to your demand, I must beg leave to ask if you can produce undeniable evidence of your being the identical person you really assume? If you are really the Count de Melville, you will excuse my caution. We cannot be too much on our guard against fraud, though I must own you have not the air of an impostor." Rinaldo's eyes began to sparkle at this preliminary question, to which he replied, that he could procure the testimony of the Emperor's minister, to whom he had occasionally paid his respects since his first arrival in England. "If that be the case," said the Jew, "take the trouble to call here tomorrow morning, at 8 o'clock, and I will carry you in my own coach to the house of His Excellency, with whom I have the honor to be acquainted, and, if he has nothing to object against your character or pretensions, I will contribute my assistance towards your obtaining justice at the imperial court." The Hungarian was so much confounded at this unexpected reception, that he had not power to thank the merchant for his promised favor, but stood motionless and silent, while the streams of emotion of the heart was of more weight with the Jew, than the eloquent acknowledgment which Ferdinand took the opportunity of making for his friend, and he was fain to dismiss them a little abruptly, in order to prevent a second discharge of that same room of which he had already complained. Melville recollected all that had happened as a dream, which had no foundation in truth, and was all day long in a sort of delirium, produced by the alternate gusts of hope and fear that still agitated his bosom, for he was not yet without apprehension of being again disappointed by some unlucky occurrence. He did not, however, fail to be punctual to the hour of his appointment, when the Jew told him there would be no occasion for visiting the ambassador, because Rinaldo had been, the preceding day, recognized by one of the clerks who had been employed as a purveyor in the imperial army, and who, knowing his family, confirmed everything he had alleged. "After breakfast," continued this benevolent Israelite, "I will give you an order upon my banker for £500, that you may be enabled to appear at Vienna as the son and representative of Count Melville, and you shall also be furnished with a letter of recommendation to a person of some influence at that court, whose friendship and countenance may be of some service to your suit, for I am now heartily engaged in your interest, in consequence of the fair and unblemished character which I find you have hitherto maintained." The reader must appeal to his own heart, to acquire a just idea of Rinaldo's feelings, when every tittle of these promises was fulfilled, and the merchant refused to take 1 farthing by way of premium, contenting himself with the slender security of a personal bond. He was, in truth, overwhelmed with the obligation, and certainly disposed to believe that his benefactor was something more than human. As for Fathom, his sentiments took a different turn, and he scrupled not to impute all this kindness to some deep-laid interested scheme, the scope of which he could not at present comprehend. After the tumults of the young gentleman's joy had subsided, and he found himself eased of that burdensome poverty under which he had groaned so long, his thoughts, which before were dissipated upon the various circumstances of distress, began to collect themselves in a body, and to resume their deliberations upon a subject which they had been long accustomed to consider. This was no other than the forlorn Monimia, whose idea now emerged in his bosom, being disencumbered of one part of the load by which it had been depressed. He mentioned her name to Fathom with marks of the most melting compassion, deplored her apostasy, and, while he protested that he had divorced her for ever from his heart, expressed an inclination to see her once more before his departure, that he might in person exhort her to penitence and reformation. Our adventurer, who dreaded such an interview as the infallible means of his own ruin, resisted the proposal with the whole power of his elocution. He affirmed that Ronaldo's desire was a manifest proof that he still retained part of the fatal poison which that enchantress had spread within his veins, and that the sight of her, softened by his reproaches into tears and affected contrition, would dispel his resentment, disable his manhood, and blow the embers of his former passion to such a rage, as would hurry him on to a reconciliation, which would debase his honor, and ruin his future peace. In a word, Ferdinand described the danger that would attend the meeting in such emphatic terms, that the Hungarian started with horror at the picture which he drew, and in this particular conformed with the admonition of his friend. £100 of the Jew's money was immediately appropriated for the payment of his most urgent debts, the like sum he presented to his friend Fathom, with a solemn promise of sharing with him whatever good fortune might await him in Germany. And though Monimia had forfeited all title to his regard, so ill could he bear the prospect of her distress, that he entrusted his dear companion with the half of what remained, to be expended for her use, fully resolving to screen her from the shocks and temptations of want, as the circumstances of his future fate would allow. Fathom, far from opposing, applauded his generosity with marks of extreme wonder and admiration, assuring him that she should be put in possession of his bounty immediately after his departure, he being unwilling to make her acquainted with her good fortune before that period, lest, finding his affairs in a fair way of being retrieved, she should be base enough to worship his returning prosperity, and, by false professions and artful blandishments, seek to ensnare his heart anew. Chapter 48. Count Fathom unmasks his battery, is repulsed, and varies his operations without effect. Every necessary preparation being made, Ronaldo, accompanied by our adventurer, took the road to Dover, where he embarked in a packet-boat for Calais, after having settled a correspondence with his dear Ferdinand, from whom he did not part without tears. He had before solicited him to be his fellow-traveller, that he might personally enjoy the benefit of his conversation and superior sagacity, but these entreaties he strenuously opposed, on pretence of his being determined to push his fortune in England, which he considered as his native country, and as the land in which, of all others, a man of merit has the best encouragement. Such were the reasons he alleged for refusing to attend his benefactor, who was himself eagerly desirous of attaining a settlement in the island of Great Britain. But our hero's real motives for staying were of a very different complexion. The reader is already informed of his aim upon the fair orphan, which, at present, was the chief spring of his conduct. He may also recollect such passages of his life, as were sufficient to deter him from reappearing at Pressburg or Vienna. But, besides these reflections, he was detained by a full persuasion that Ronaldo would sink under the power and influence of his antagonist, consequently be rendered incapable to provide for his friends, and that he himself, fraught with wiles and experience as he was, could not fail to make himself amends for what he had suffered among a people equally rich and unthinking. Melville, having embraced our adventurer, and with a deep sigh bid him take care of the unfortunate Monimia, committed himself to the sea, and, by the assistance of a favorable gale, was in 4 hours safely landed on the French shore, while Fathom took post-horses for London, where he arrived that same night, and next day, in the forenoon, went to visit the beauteous mourner, who had as yet received no intimation of Ronaldo's departure or design. He found her in the attitude of writing a letter to her inconstant lover, the contents of which the reader will be acquainted with in due time. Her countenance, notwithstanding the veil of melancholy by which it was overcast, seemed altogether serene and composed. She was the picture of pious resignation, and sat like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief. After having paid the compliment of the morning, Fathom begged pardon for having omitted to visit her during 3 days, in which, he said, his time had been wholly engrossed in procuring a proper equipage for Count Melville, who had at last bid an eternal adieu to the island of Great Britain. At this information the hapless Monimia fell back in her chair, and continued some minutes in a swoon, from which being recovered, "Excuse me, Mr. Fathom," cried she with a deep sigh, "this, I hope, is the last agony I shall feel from my unhappy passion." Then wiping the tears from her lovely eyes, she retrieved her tranquillity, and desired to know by what means Ronaldo had been enabled to undertake his journey into the Empire. Our hero, upon this occasion, assumed the whole merit of having promoted the interest of his friend, by giving her to understand, that he, in consequence of an unforeseen windfall, had defrayed the expense of the Count's equipment, though he observed that it was not without reluctance he saw Rinaldo make a wrong use of his friendship. Although I was happy, proceeded this artful traitor, in being able to discharge my obligations to the house of Melville, I could not help feeling the most sensible chagrin, when I saw my assistance rendered subservient to the triumphs of the youth's baseness and infidelity, for he chose, as the companion of his travels, the abandoned woman for whom he had forsaken the all-perfect Monimia, whose virtue and accomplishments did not preserve her sacred from his ungrateful sarcasms and unmannerly ridicule. Believe me, madam, I was so shocked at his conversation on that subject, and so much incensed at his want of delicacy, that my temper was scarce sufficient for the ceremony of parting. And, now that my debt to his family is overpaid, I have solemnly renounced his correspondence. When she heard that, instead of betraying the least symptom of regret or compassion for her unhappy fate, the perfidious youth had exulted over her fall, and even made her a subject for his mirth, the blood revisited her faded cheeks, and resentment restored to her eyes that poignancy which sorrow had before overcome. Yet she scorned to give speech to her indignation, but, forcing a smile, "Why should I repine," said she, "at the mortifications of a life which I despise, and from which, I hope, Heaven speedily will set me free?" Fathom, fired by her emotion, which had recalled all the graces of her beauty, exclaimed in a rapture, "Talk not so contemptuously of this life, which hath still a fund of happiness in store for the amiable, the divine Monimia. Though one admirer hath proved an apostate to his vows, your candor will not suffer you to condemn the whole sex. Some there are, whose bosoms glow with passion equally pure, unalterable, and intense. For my own part, I have sacrificed to a rigid punctilio of honor the dearest ideas of my heart. I beheld your unrivaled charms, and deeply felt their power. Yet, while a possibility of Melville's reformation remained, and while I was restrained by my niggard fortune from making a tender worthy of your acceptance, I combated with my inclinations, and bore without repining the pangs of hopeless love. But, now that my honor is disengaged, and my fortune rendered independent, by the last will of a worthy nobleman, whose friendship I was favored with in France, I presume to lay myself at the feet of the adorable Monimia, as the most faithful of admirers, whose happiness or misery wholly depends upon her nod. Believe me, madam, these are not the professions of idle gallantry. I speak the genuine, though imperfect, language of my heart. Words, even the most pathetic, cannot do justice to my love. I gaze upon your beauty with ravishment, but I contemplate the graces of your soul with such awful veneration, that I tremble while I approach you, as if my vows were addressed to some superior being. During this declaration, which was pronounced in the most emphatic manner, Monimia was successively agitated with shame, anger, and grief. Nevertheless, she summoned her whole philosophy to her aid, and, with a tranquil, though determined air, begged he would not diminish the obligations he had already conferred, by disturbing with such unseasonable addresses a poor unhappy maid, who had detached all her thoughts from earthly objects, and waited impatiently for that dissolution which alone could put a period to her misfortunes. Fathom, imagining that these were no other than the suggestions of a temporary disappointment and despondence, which it was his business to oppose with all his eloquence and art, renewed his theme with redoubled ardor, and, at last, became so importunate in his desires, that Monimia, provoked beyond the power of concealing her resentment, said, she was heartily sorry to find herself under the necessity of telling him, that, in the midst of her misfortunes, she could not help remembering what she had been. Then, rising from her seat, with all the dignity of displeasure, perhaps, added she, you have forgot who was the father of the once happy Monimia. With these words she retired into another chamber, leaving our adventurer confounded by the repulse he had sustained. Not that he was discouraged from prosecuting his aim, on the contrary, this rebuff seemed to add fresh vigor to his operations. He now thought it high time to bring over Madame la Mère to his interest, and, to facilitate her conversion, took an opportunity of bribing her with some inconsiderable presents, after having amused her with a plausible tale of his passion for Monimia, with whom she undertook the office of his mediatrix, on the supposition that his intentions were honorable, and highly advantageous to her lodger. She was, first of all, invested with the office of obtaining pardon for the offense he had given, and, in this negotiation she succeeded so well, as to become an advocate for his suit. Accordingly, she took all occasions of magnifying his praise. His agreeable person was often the subject of her discourse to the fair mourner. Her admiration dwelt upon his politeness, good sense, and winning deportment, and she every day retailed little stories of his benevolence and greatness of soul. The defect in his birth she represented as a circumstance altogether foreign from the consideration of his merit, especially in a nation where such distinctions are as little respected as they will be in a future state. She mentioned several persons of note, who basked in the sunshine of power and fortune, without having enjoyed the least hereditary assistance from their forefathers. One, she said, sprung from the loins of an obscure attorney, another was the grandson of a valet de chamber, a third was the issue of an accountant, and a fourth the offspring of a woolen draper. All these were the children of their own good works, and had raised themselves upon their personal virtues and address, a foundation certainly more solid and honorable than a vague inheritance derived from ancestors, in whose deserts they could not be supposed to have borne the least share. Monimia listened to all these arguments with great patience and affability, though she at once dived into the source from which all such insinuations flowed. She joined in the commendations of Fathom, and owned herself a particular instance of that benevolence which the old lady had so justly extolled, but, once for all, to prevent the supplication which Madame la Mère was about to make, she solemnly protested that her heart was altogether shut against any other earthly engagement, and that her thoughts were altogether employed upon her eternal salvation. The assiduous landlady, perceiving the steadiness of her disposition, thought proper to alter her method of proceeding, and, for the present, suspended that theme by which she found her fair lodger disobliged. Resolved to reconcile Monimia to life, before she would again recommend Ferdinand to her love, she endeavored to amuse her imagination, by recounting the occasional incidents of the day, hoping gradually to decoy her attention to those sublunary objects from which it had been industriously weaned. She seasoned her conversation with agreeable sallies, enlarged upon the different scenes of pleasure and diversion appertaining to this great metropolis, practiced upon her palate with the delicacies of eating, endeavored to shake her temperance with repeated proffers and recommendations of certain cordials and restoratives, which she alleged were necessary for the recovery of her health, and pressed her to make little excursions into the fields that skirt the town, for the benefit of air and exercise. While this auxiliary plied the disconsolate Monimia on one hand, Fathom was not remiss on the other. He now seemed to have sacrificed his passion to her quiet, his discourse turned upon more indifferent subjects. He endeavored to dispel her melancholy with arguments drawn from philosophy and religion. On some occasions, he displayed all his fund of good humor, with a view to beguile her sorrow. He importuned her to give him the pleasure of squiring her to some place of innocent entertainment, and, finally, insisted upon her accepting a pecuniary reinforcement to her finances, which he knew to be in a most consumptive condition. Chapter 49, Monimia's honor is protected by the interposition of heaven. With that complacency and fortitude which were peculiar to herself, this hapless stranger resisted all those artful temptations. Her sustenance was barely such as exempted her from the guilt of being accessory to her own death. Her drink was the simple element. She encouraged no discourse but that which turned upon the concerns of her immortal part. She never went abroad, except in visits to a French chapel in the neighborhood. She refused the proffered assistance of our adventurer with equal obstinacy and politeness, and with pleasure saw herself wasting towards that period of mortality which was the consummation of her wish. Yet her charms, far from melting away with her constitution, seemed to triumph over the decays of nature. Her shape and features still retained that harmony for which they had always been distinguished. A mixture of majesty and sweetness diffused itself in her looks, and her feebleness added to that soft and feminine grace which attracts the sympathy, and engages the protection of every humane beholder. The associates thus baffled in their attempts to excite her ideas of pleasure, again shifted their plan, and resolved to attack this forlorn beauty on the side of fear and mortification. Our adventurer became less frequent in his visits, and more indifferent in his language and deportment, while Madame la Mère gradually relaxed in that complacency and respect with which she had hitherto behaved towards her fair lodger. She even began to drop hints of disapprobation and reproach against this pattern of innocence and beauty, and at length grew bold enough to tell her that her misfortunes could be attributed to nothing but her own obstinacy and pride, that she had been at great pains to disoblige the only person who was able and willing to raise her above dependence, and that, if his protection should be withdrawn, she must be exposed to the utmost extremity of distress. These insinuations, instead of producing the desired effect, inflamed the indignation of Monimia, who, in a most dignified style of rebuke, chid her for her indelicacy and presumption, observing that she could have no title to take such freedoms with lodgers, whose punctuality and regular deportment left her no room to complain. Notwithstanding this animated reply, she underwent the most deplorable anguish, when she reflected upon the insolence of this woman, from whose barbarity she had no resource, and, seeing no other possibility of redress than that of appealing to the good offices of Fathom, she conquered her reluctance so far as to complain to him of Madame la Mère's incivility. Pleased with this application, he gave her to understand, with very little ceremony or preamble, that it wholly depended upon herself whether she should continue to be wretched, or be delivered at once from all her cares and perplexity, that, notwithstanding the disdain with which she had treated his addresses, he was still ready to lay himself and his fortune at her feet, and that, if she should again reject the disinterested proposal, the whole world and her own conscience would charge upon herself whatever calamities she might be subjected to in the sequel. Interpreting into a favorable hesitation her silence, which was the result of wrath and amazement, he proceeded to throw himself at her feet, and utter a romantic rhapsody, in the course of which, laying aside all that restraint which he had hitherto preserved, he seized her delicate hand, and pressed it to his lips. Nay, so far did he forget himself on this occasion, that he caught the fair creature in his arms, and rudely ravished a kiss from those lips which he had before contemplated with the most distant reverence of desire. Having thus broken down the fences of decorum, and being heated with transport, he, in all probability, would have acted the part of young Tarquin, and violated by force that sacred shrine of honor, beauty, and unblemished truth, had not the wrath kindled by such an unexpected outrage inspired her with strength and spirit sufficient to protect her virtue, and intimidate the ruffian who could offer violence to such perfection. She broke from his detested embrace with surprising agility, and called aloud to her landlady for assistance, but that discreet matron was resolved to hear nothing, and Fathom's appetite being whetted to a most brutal degree of eagerness, "Madam," said he, "all opposition is vain. What you have refused to my entreaties, you shall yield to my power, and I am determined to force you to your own advantage." So saying, he sprung towards her, with the most savage and impious intent, when this amiable heroine, snatching up his sword, which lay upon a by-table, and unsheathing it instantaneously, presented the point to his breast, and, while her eyes glanced with intolerable keenness, "Villain," cried she, "the spirit of my father animates my bosom, and the vengeance of heaven shall not be frustrated." He was not so much affected by his bodily danger, as awestruck at the manner of her address, and the appearance of her aspect, which seemed to shine with something supernatural, and actually disordered his whole faculties, insomuch that he retreated without attempting to make the least reply, and she, having secured the door after his departure, sat down to ponder upon this shocking event. Words are wanting to describe the accumulated horrors that took possession of her mind, when she thus beheld all her presaging fears realized, and found herself at the mercy of two wretches, who had now pulled off the mask, after having lost all sentiments of humanity. Common affliction was an agreeable reverie to what she suffered, deprived of her parents, exiled from her friends and country, reduced to the brink of wanting the most indispensable necessaries of life, in a foreign land, where she knew not one person to whose protection she could have recourse, from the inexpressible woes that environed her. She complained to heaven that her life was protracted, for the augmentation of that misery which was already too severe to be endured, for she shuddered at the prospect of being utterly abandoned in the last stage of mortality, without one friend to close her eyes, or do the last offices of humanity to her breathless corse. These were dreadful reflections to a young lady who had been born to affluence and splendor, trained up in all the elegance of education, by nature fraught with that sensibility which refines the sentiment and taste, and so tenderly cherished by her indulgent parents, that they suffered not the winds of heaven to visit her face too roughly. Having passed the night in such agony, she rose at daybreak, and, hearing the chapel bell toll for morning prayers, resolved to go to this place of worship, in order to implore the assistance of heaven. She no sooner opened her chamber door, with this intent, than she was met by Madame la Mère, who, after having professed her concern for what had happened overnight, and imputed Mr. Fathom's rudeness to the spirit of intoxication, by which she had never before seen him possessed, she endeavored to dissuade Monimia from her purpose, by observing, that her health would be prejudiced by the cold morning air, but finding her determined, she insisted upon accompanying her to chapel, on pretence of respect, though, in reality, with a view to prevent the escape of her beauteous lodger. Thus attended, the hapless mourner entered the place, and, according to the laudable hospitality of England, which is the only country in Christendom where a stranger is not made welcome to the house of God, this amiable creature, emaciated and enfeebled as she was, must have stood in a common passage during the whole service, had not she been perceived by a humane gentlewoman, struck with her beauty and dignified air, and melted with sympathy at the ineffable sorrow which was visible in her countenance, opened the pew in which she sat, and accommodated Monimia and her attendant. If she was captivated by her first appearance, she was not less affected by the deportment of her fair guest, which was the pattern of genuine devotion. In a word, this good lady, who was a merchant's widow in opulent circumstances, was inflamed with a longing desire to know and befriend the amiable stranger, who, after service, turning about to thank her for her civility, Madame Clement, with that frankness which is the result of true benevolence, told her, she was too much prepossessed in her favor to let slip this opportunity of craving her acquaintance, and of expressing her inclination to alleviate, if possible, that affliction which was manifest in her looks. Monimia, overwhelmed with gratitude and surprise at this unexpected address, gazed upon the lady in silence, and when she repeated her tenders of service, could make no other reply to her goodness, than by bursting into a flood of tears. This was a species of eloquence which did not pass unregarded by Madame Clement, who, while her own eyes were bedewed with the drops of sympathy and compassion, took the lovely orphan by the hand, and led her, without further ceremony, to her own coach, that stood waiting at the door, whither they were followed by Mrs. la Mère, who was so much confounded at the adventure, that she made no objections to the proposal of the lady, who handed her lodger into the carriage, but retired, with all possible dispatch, to make Fathom acquainted with this unforeseen event. Meanwhile the agitation of Monimia, at this providential deliverance, was such as had well nigh destroyed her tender frame. The blood flushed and forsook her cheeks by turns, she trembled from head to foot, notwithstanding the consolatory assurances of Madame Clement, and, without being able to utter one word, was conducted to the house of that kind benefactress, where the violence of her transports overpowered her constitution, and she sunk down upon a couch in a swoon, from which she was not easily recovered. This affecting circumstance augmented the pity, and interested the curiosity of Madame Clement, who concluded there was something very extraordinary in the case of the stranger, to produce these agonies, and grew impatient to hear the particulars of her story. Monimia no sooner retrieved the use of her faculties, than looking around, and observing with what humane concern her new hostess was employed in effecting her recovery, "Is this," said she, "a flattering illusion of the brain? Or am I really under the protection of some beneficent being, whom heaven hath inspired with generosity to rescue an hapless stranger from the most forlorn state of misery and woe?" Her voice was at all times ravishingly sweet, and this exclamation was pronounced with such pathetic fervor, that Madame Clement clasped her in her arms, and kissing her with all the eagerness of maternal affection, "Yes," cried she, "fair creature, heaven hath bestowed upon me an heart to compassionate, and power, I hope, to lighten the burden of your sorrows." She then prevailed upon her to take some nourishment, and afterwards to recount the particulars of her fate, a task she performed with such accuracy and candor, that Madame Clement, far from suspecting her sincerity, saw truth and conviction in every circumstance of her tale, and, having condoled her misfortunes, entreated her to forget them, or at least look upon herself as one sheltered under the care and tuition of a person whose study it would be to supply her want of natural parents. This would have been an happy vicissitude of fortune, had it not arrived too late, but such a sudden and unlooked-for transition not only disordered the faculties of poor Monimia's mind, but also overpowered the organs of her body, already fatigued and enfeebled by the distresses she had undergone, so that she was taken ill of a fever that same night, and became delirious before morning, when a physician was called to her assistance. While this gentleman was in the house, Madame Clement was visited by Fathom, who, after having complained, in the most insinuating manner that she had encouraged his wife to abandon her duty, told her a plausible story of his first acquaintance with Monimia, and his marriage at the Fleet, which, he said, he was ready to prove by the evidence of the clergyman who joined them, and that of Mrs. La Mare, who was present at the ceremony. The good lady, although a little staggered at the genteel appearance and engaging address of this stranger, could not prevail upon herself to believe that she had been imposed upon by her fair lodger, who by this time had given too convincing a proof of her sincerity. Nevertheless, in order to prevent any dispute that might be prejudicial to the health or recovery of Monimia, she gave him to understand that she would not at present enter upon the merits of the cause, but only assure him that the young lady was actually bereft of her senses, and in imminent danger of her life, for the truth of which assertions she would appeal to his own observation, and the opinion of the physician, who was then employed in writing a prescription for the cure of her disease. So saying, she conducted him into the chamber, where he beheld the hapless virgin stretched upon a sick bed, panting under the violence of a distemper too mighty for her weakly frame, her hair dishevelled, and discomposure in her looks. All the roses of her youth were faded, yet all the graces of her beauty were not fled. She retained that sweetness and symmetry, which death itself could not destroy, and though her discourse was incoherent, her voice was still musical, resembling those feathered songsters who warble their native wood notes wild. Fathom, as upon all other occasions, so on this, did behave like an inimitable actor. He ran to the bedside, with all the trepidation of a distracted lover. He fell upon his knees, and, while the tears rolled down his cheeks, imprinted 1,000 kisses on the soft hand of Monimia, who regarding him with a lackluster and undistinguishing eye, alas! "Rinaldo," said she, "we were born to be unhappy." "Would to heaven," cried Ferdinand, in a transport of grief, "the wretch Rinaldo had never been born. That is the villain who seduced the affection of this unfortunate woman. I admitted the traitor into my friendship and confidence, relieved him in his necessities, and, like the ungrateful viper, he hath stung the very bosom that cherished him in his distress." Then he proceeded to inform Madame Clement how he had delivered that same Rinaldo from prison, maintained him afterwards at a great expense, and at length furnished him with a sum of money and proper credentials to support his interest at the court of Vienna. Having finished this detail, he asked the physician's sentiments of his wife's distemper, and being told that her life was in extreme jeopardy, begged he would use his utmost endeavors in her behalf, and even made him a tender of an extraordinary fee, which was refused. He also thanked Madame Clement for her charity and benevolence towards a stranger, and took his leave with many polite professions of gratitude and esteem. He had no sooner quitted the house, than the physician, who was a humane man, and a foreigner, began to caution the lady against his insinuations, observing that some circumstances of the story concerning Rinaldo were, to his particular knowledge, contrary to truth, for that he himself had been applied to for letters of recommendation in behalf of Count Melville, by a Jew merchant of his acquaintance, who had supplied the young gentleman with money sufficient for his occasions, in consequence of a minute inquiry he had made into the character of Rinaldo, who was, by all reports, a youth of strict honor and untainted morals. Madame Clement, thus cautioned, entered into deliberation with her own thoughts, and, comparing the particulars of this account with those of Monimia's own story, she concluded that Fathom was the very traitor he himself had described, and that he had, by abusing the confidence of both, effected a fatal breach between two innocent and deserving lovers. She accordingly looked upon him with horror and detestation, but nevertheless resolved to treat him with civility in the meantime, that the poor young lady might not be disturbed in her last moments, for she had now lost all hopes of her recovery. Yet the fever abated, and in 2 days she retrieved the use of her reason, though the distemper had affected her lungs, and she was in all appearance doomed to linger a few weeks longer in a consumption. Fathom was punctual in his visitation, though never admitted into her presence after the delirium vanished, and he had the opportunity of seeing her conveyed in a chariot to Kensington gravel pits, a place which may be termed the last stage of many a mortal peregrination. He now implicitly believed that death would in a few days baffle all his designs upon the unfortunate Monimia, and foreseeing that, as he had owned himself her husband, he might be obliged to defray the expenses incurred by her sickness and burial, he very prudently intermitted in his visits, and had recourse to the intelligence of his auxiliary. As for Monimia, she approached the goal of life, not simply with resignation, but with rapture. She enjoyed in tranquillity the conversation of her kind benefactress, who never stirred from her apartment. She was blessed with the spiritual consolation of a worthy clergyman, who removed all her religious scruples, and she congratulated herself on the near prospect of that land of peace where sorrow is not known. At length Mrs. Lummare gave notice to our adventurer of this amiable young lady's decease, and the time fixed for the interment. Upon which these two virtuous associates took possession of a place from whence they could, unperceived, behold the funeral. He must have a hard heart, who, without an emotion of pity, can see the last offices performed to a young creature cut off in the flower of youth and beauty, even though he knows not her name, and is an utter stranger to her virtues. How callous then must the soul of that wretch have been, who, without a symptom of remorse or concern, saw the sable hearse adorned with white plumes, as emblems of Monimia's purity, pass before him, while her incomparable merit stood full in his remembrance, and he knew himself the wicked cause of her untimely fate. Perfidious wretch! Thy crimes turn out so atrocious, that I half repent me of having undertaken to record thy memoirs, yet such monsters ought to be exhibited to public view, that mankind may be upon their guard against imposture, that the world may see how fraud is apt to overshoot itself, and that, as virtue, though it may suffer for a while, will triumph in the end, so iniquity, though it may prosper for a season, will at last be overtaken by that punishment and disgrace which are its due. Chapter 50, Fathom shifts the scene, and appears in a new character. Fathom's expectations with respect to the fair orphan having thus proved abortive, he lost no time in bewailing his miscarriage, but had immediate recourse to other means of improving his small fortune, which, at this period, amounted to near £200. Whatever inclination he had to resume the character he had formerly borne in the polite world, he durst not venture to launch out again into the expense necessary to maintain that station, because his former resources were now stopped, and all the people of fashion by this time convinced of his being a needy adventurer. Nevertheless, he resolved to sound the sentiments of his old friends at a distance, and judge, from the reception he should meet with, how far he might presume upon their countenance and favor. For he rightly supposed, that if he could in any shape contribute to their interest or amusement, they would easily forgive his former pretensions to quality, arrogant as they were, and still entertain him on the footing of a necessary acquaintance. With this view, he one day presented himself at court in a very gay suit of clothes, and bowed, at a distance, to many of his old fashionable friends of both sexes, not one of whom favoured him with any other notice, than that of a quarter curtsy, or slight inclination of the head. For, by this time, the few that remembered him knew from what retirement he now emerged, and avoided him accordingly as the jail infection. But the greater part of those who had cultivated him in the zenith of his fortune were now utter strangers to his person, which they had actually forgot, amidst the succession of novelties that surrounded them, or, if they did recollect his name, it was remembered as an old fashion which had been many months out of date. Notwithstanding these mortifying discouragements, our hero, that same evening, effected a lodgment in a certain gaming house not far from St. James's, and, as he played pretty high, and made a parade of his ready money, he was soon recognized by divers persons of consequence, who cordially welcomed him to England, on pretence of believing he had been abroad, and with great complacency repeated their former professions of friendship. Though this was a certain way of retaining the favor of those worthies, while his finances continued to flourish, and his payments were prompt, he knew the weakness of his funds too well, to think they could bear the vicissitudes of play, and the remembrance of the 2 British knights who had spoiled him at Paris, hung over his imagination with the most frightful presages. Besides, he perceived that gaming was now managed in such a manner, as rendered skill and dexterity of no advantage. For the spirit of play having overspread the land, like a pestilence, raged to such a degree of madness and desperation, that the unhappy people who were infected, laid aside all thoughts of amusement, economy, or caution, and risked their fortunes upon issues equally extravagant, childish, and absurd. The whole mystery of the art was reduced to the simple exercise of tossing up a guinea, and the lust of laying wagers, which they indulged to a surprising pitch of ridiculous intemperance. In one corner of the room might be heard a pair of lordlings running their grandmothers against each other, that is, betting sums on the longest liver. In another the success of the wager depended upon the sex of the landlady's next child, and one of the waiters happening to drop down in an apoplectic fit, a certain noble peer exclaimed, "Dead for £1,000. The challenge was immediately accepted, and when the master of the house sent for a surgeon to attempt the cure, the nobleman, who set the price upon the patient's head, insisted upon his being left to the efforts of nature alone, otherwise the wager should be void. Nay, when the landlord harped upon the loss he should sustain by the death of a trusty servant, his lordship obviated the objection, by desiring that the fellow might be charged in the bill. In short, the rage of gaming seemed to have devoured all their other faculties, and to have equalled the rash enthusiasm of the inhabitants of Malacca in the East Indies, who are so possessed with that pernicious spirit, that they sacrifice to it not only their fortunes, but also their wives and children, and then letting their hair down upon their shoulders, in imitation of the ancient Lacedaemonians when they devoted themselves to death, those wretches unsheath their daggers, and murder every living creature in their way. In this, however, they differ from the gamesters of our country, who never find their senses, until they have lost their fortunes, and beggared their families, whereas the Malays never run amok, but in consequence of misery and despair. Such are the amusements, or rather such is the continual employment of those hopeful youths who are destined by birth to be the judges of our property, and pillars of our constitution. Such are the heirs and representatives of those patriots who planned, and those heroes who maintained, the laws and freedom of their country, who were the patrons of merit, the fathers of the poor, the terror of vice and immorality, and at once the ornaments and support of a happy nation. Our adventurer considered all these circumstances with his wonted sagacity, and, seeing upon what precarious footing he must stand, should he rank himself with such society, he wisely came to the resolution of descending one step in the degrees of life, and of taking upon him the title of physician, under which he did not despair of insinuating himself into the pockets of his patients, and into the secrets of private families, so as to acquire a comfortable share of practice, or captivate the heart of some heiress or rich widow, whose fortune would at once render him independent and happy. After this determination, his next care was to concert measures for his first appearance in this new character, well knowing that the success of a physician, in a great measure, depends upon the external equipage in which he first declares himself an adept in the healing art. He first of all procured a few books on the subject of medicine, which he studied with great attention during the remaining part of the winter and spring, and repaired to Tunbridge with the first of the season, where he appeared in the uniform of Aesculapius, namely, a plain suit, full trimmed, with a voluminous tie periwig, believing that in this place he might glide, as it were, imperceptibly into the functions of his new employment, and gradually accustom himself to the method and form of prescription. A man so well known in the gay world could not be supposed to effect such a transformation without being observed, and therefore, in order to anticipate the censure and ridicule of those who might be tempted to make themselves merry at his expense, he, on his arrival at the Wells, repaired to the shop of an apothecary, and calling for pen, ink, and paper, wrote a prescription, which he desired might be immediately made up. While this was doing by the servant, he was invited into a parlour by the master, with whom he entered into conversation touching the properties of the Tunbridge water, which seemed to have been his particular study, and indeed he had perused Rizzi's treatise on that subject with indefatigable assiduity. From this theme, he made digressions into other parts of medicine, upon which he spoke with such plausible elocution, that the apothecary, whose knowledge in that art was not very profound, looked upon him as a physician of great learning and experience, and hinted a desire of knowing his name and situation. Fathom accordingly gave him to understand that he had studied physic, and taken his degrees at Padua, rather for his amusement, than with any view of exercising medicine, as he then could not possibly foresee the misfortunes which had since happened to his family, and by which he was now compelled to have recourse to a profession that was very much beneath the expectations of his birth. Yet he bore his disappointments with resignation, and even good humor, and blessed his stars for having inclined him to the study of any branch of knowledge by which he might be enabled to laugh at the vicissitudes of fortune. He then observed that he had practised with some applause at the Hot Well near Bristol, before he thought he should be ever reduced to the necessity of taking a fee, and that, in all probability, his metamorphosis, when known, would furnish matter of surprise and merriment to some of his old acquaintance. The apothecary was equally struck with his polite address, and pleased with his agreeable discourse. He consoled him for the misfortunes of his family, by assuring him that in England nothing could be more honorable, or indeed profitable, than the character of a physician, provided he could once wriggle himself into practice, and insinuated that, although he was restricted by certain engagements with other persons of the faculty, he should be glad of an opportunity to show his regard for Dr. Fathom. This was a very effectual method which our hero took to intimate his new character to the public. By the industry and communicative disposition of the apothecary, it was circulated in half a day through every family in the place, and, next morning, when Ferdinand appeared, the company forthwith assembled in separate groups, and from each knot he heard his name reverberated in a whisper. Having thus announced himself to all whom it might concern, and allowed the ladies 2 days to discuss the merit of his transfiguration, together with the novelty of the case, he ventured to salute, at a distance, a lady and her daughter, who had been his patients at the Hot Well, and, although they honored his bow with the return of a slight curtsy, they gave him not the least encouragement to make a nearer approach. Notwithstanding this rebuff, he concluded that, should the health of either come in question, they would renew their application to his skill, and what was refused by their pride would be granted by their apprehension. Here, however, he happened to be mistaken in his conjecture. The young lady being seized with a violent headache and palpitation, her mother desired the apothecary to recommend a physician, and the person with whom he was contracted being at that time absent, he proposed Dr. Fathom as a man of great ability and discretion. But the good lady rejected the proposal with disdain, because she had formerly known him in the character of a count, though that very character was the chief reason that had then induced her to crave his advice. Such is the caprice of the world in general, that whatever bears the face of novelty captivates, or rather bewitches, the imagination, and confounds the ideas of reason and common sense. If, for example, a scullion, from the clinking of pewter, shall conceive a taste for the clinking of rhyme, and make shift to bring together 20 syllables, so as that the 10th and last shall have the like ending, the composition is immediately extolled as a miracle, and what appeals to the admiration is not the wit, the elegance, or poetry of the work, but the uncultivated talent and humble station of the author. A reader does not exclaim, "What a delicate sentiment! What a beautiful simile! What easy and musical versification!" but cries in rapture, "Heavens! What a prodigy, a poet from the scullery! A muse in livery! Or, Apollo with a trowel!" The public is astonished into liberality, the scullion eats from those trenchers he scoured before, the footman is admitted into the coach behind which he was wont to stand, and the bricklayer, instead of plastering walls, bedaubs his illustrious partner with the mortar of his praise. Thus, lifted into a higher sphere, their talents receive cultivation, they become professed bards, and though their subsequent works bear evident marks of improvement, they are neglected among the rest of their brethren, because that novelty, which recommended them in the beginning, no longer remains. So it fared with our adventurer in his new occupation. There was something so extraordinary in a nobleman's understanding medicine, and so uncommon in a physician's prescribing gratis, that the curiosity and admiration of the company at Bristol were engaged, and they followed his advice, as the direction of some supernatural intelligence. But, now that he professed himself one of the faculty, and might be supposed to have refreshed his memory, and reinforced his knowledge for the occasion, he was as much overlooked as any other physician unsupported by interest or cabal, or, at least, the notice he attracted was not at all to the advantage of his character, because it wholly regarded the decline of his fortune, which is a never-failing fund of disgrace. These mortifications did not overcome the patience and perseverance of Fathom, who foresaw that the soothing hand of time would cast a veil of oblivion over those scenes which were remembered to his prejudice, and that, in the meantime, though he was excluded from the private parties of the fair sex, in which his main hope of success was placed, he should be able to insinuate himself into some degree of favor and practice among the male patients, and some lucky cure, properly displayed, might be the means of propagating his fame, and banishing that reserve which at present interfered with his purpose. Accordingly, it was not long before he found means to break that spell of universal prejudice that hedged him in. At the ordinary which he frequented, his polite carriage, facetious remarks, and agreeable stories soon conciliated the regard of his fellow guests, among whom he sometimes rallied his own transformation with singular good humor and success. He was even witty upon his want of employment, and used to observe that a physician without practice had one comfort to which his brethren were strangers, namely, that the seldomer he had occasion to prescribe, the less he had upon his conscience on account of being accessory to the death of his fellow creatures. Nothing so effectually blunts the shafts of ridicule, and defeats the aims of slander, as this method of anticipation. In spite of the arrows that were levelled against his reputation from every tea-table at Tunbridge, he made his party good among almost all the gay young gentlemen that frequented the place. Far from avoiding his company, they began to court his conversation, and he was commonly seen in the walks surrounded with a group of admirers. Having thus paved the way for a total removal of the invidious prepossession that obstructed his views, he, one night, while every person was lulled in the arms of repose, and universal silence prevailed, tuned his violin, and began to play some masterly airs, in a tone so uncommonly expressive, and with such ravishing dexterity of execution, that a certain lady, who lodged in the same house, being waked by the music, and ignorant of the source from which it flowed, listened with rapture, as to the harp of an angel, and, wrapping herself in a loose gown, rose and opened her chamber door, in order to discover in what apartment the musician resided. She no sooner entered the passage, than she found her fellow lodgers already assembled on the same occasion, and there they remained during the best part of the night, transported by the harmony which our hero produced. Dr. Fathom was immediately known to be the author of this entertainment, and thus retrieved the benefit of that admiration which he had forfeited by appearing in the shape of a physician. For, as people had formerly wondered to see a count skilled in medicine, they were now amazed to find a physician such a master in music. The good effects of this stratagem were almost instantaneous. His performance became the topic of discourse among all the fashionable company. His male friends complimented him from the information of the other sex, and that lady whom he had regaled, instead of that shyness and disdain with which she used to receive his salutation, at their very next meeting in the thoroughfare, returned his bow with marks of profound respect. Nay, at midnight, she, with the rest, took post in the same place where they had been stationed before, and, by frequent tittering, and repeated whispers, gave intimation to Fathom, that they would be glad of a second serenade. But he was too well acquainted with the human passions to indulge this their desire. It was his interest to inflame their impatience, rather than to gratify their expectation, and therefore he tantalized them for some hours, by tuning his violin, and playing some flourishes, which, however, produced nothing to fulfill their wishes. At the ordinary, he was accosted by a gentleman, a lodger in the same house, who assured him that the ladies would take it as a great favor if he would let them know when he intended to amuse himself again with his instrument, that they might not, by falling asleep beforehand, deprive themselves of the pleasure of hearing his music. To this message he replied, with an air of consequence and reserve, that, though music was not the art he professed, he should be always complaisant enough to entertain the ladies to the utmost of his power, when their commands were signified to him in a manner suited to his character, but that he would never put himself on the footing of an itinerant harper, whose music is tolerated through the medium of a board partition. The gentleman having reported this answer to his constituents, they empowered him to invite Dr. Fathom to breakfast, and he was next morning introduced with the usual ceremony, and treated with uncommon regard by all the females of the house, assembled for his reception. Having thus broken the ice of their aversion in one part, so as that the beams of his personal accomplishments had room to operate, he soon effected a general thaw in his favor, and found himself growing once more into request amongst the most amiable part of the creation. His company was coveted, and his taste consulted in their balls, concerts, and private assemblies, and he recompensed the regard they paid to him with an incessant exertion of his agreeable talents, politeness, and good humor.